It's been a big week in politics. Is there an election in the air? The parties are gearing up for a fight. The Prime Minister setting out a dramatic change in policy.
We seem to have defaulted to an approach which will impose unacceptable costs on hard-pressed British families.
Delaying some net zero targets.
We're plugging green electricity.
The wishful thinking here is that we have not got a policy package to hit the legal targets that this country has set in law through the Climate Change Act.
While Keir Starmer was in Europe, trying to show he can have good relationships with EU leaders, as his party promises a different approach to climate change.
When the government flip-flops and changes its mind all the time, it's very difficult for businesses to make those investments.
The conference season is now underway, and with more by-elections around the corner, our main question this morning is, has the starting gun been fired on the next general election? On behalf of the government this week, it's Grant Shapps, the new Defence Secretary. Hot-footing it from his party's conference in Bournemouth, the Lib Dem leader, Sir Ed Davey, is here to talk to us. And for Labour, we'll talk live to Darren Jones, the brand new Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury. Hello, obviously I'm not Laura. She couldn't be here today, so I've stepped in. Good morning to you, wherever you are watching across the UK. Do let me introduce you to today's panel. We have Rachel Johnson, broadcaster and journalist. We have Yanis Varoufakis, left-wing economist and Greece's finance minister during that country's credit crisis 8 years ago. And we have Craig McKinley, Conservative MP and chair of the Net Zero Scrutiny Group. Good morning to all of you.
Yeah, morning.
Thank you very much for being here. We're going to have a look at some of today's front pages. First up, let's have a look at HS2 then. The possible fate of HS2 leads some of the newspapers this Sunday morning. The Telegraph says axe looms over HS2 after £8 billion cost shock. The Observer goes with Sunak pushes to axe HS2 link ahead of Tory conference. And The Independent leads with now Tory big beasts turn on PM's insane plan to scrap HS2. The Mail goes with something different. PM will not axe the triple lock on pensions, it says. And The Times says Sunak revives plans to slash inheritance tax. Something that is not confirmed by Downing Street, I should say. But is it something, Craig McKinley, you would like to see ahead of the next election?
Yeah, I've written a number of papers about inheritance tax, just the inherent unfairness about it. I've always thought if you've got cash in the bank, you have spent every bit of tax has been paid to get cash in the bank. I would prefer a form of capital gains tax on an asset that obviously has not been derived from cash, a painting on the wall or whatever it might be.
But can I just, on inheritance tax, only 4% of households pay it. And you've got basically a married couple a threshold of about £1 million.
Not for all people. You have to have a descendant route to give that to. It's quite complicated. I think that is the inherent problem with inheritance tax. And you've definitely got a north-south divide. For people in the south, they could pay inheritance tax through no reason other than they've got a property in the south of the country rather than the north.
Rachel Johnson, that floated in the Sunday Times. As I said, speculation, not confirmed by Downing Street. We've had other policies floated this week, A-level reform, potentially a smoking ban. Does it feel like a general election is in the air?
Well, the front page of the Mail on Sunday, when Rishi Sunak is not flip-flopping now, it becomes the splash of a Sunday newspaper, which gives some indication, which is he does seem to be changing his mind on a lot of big policies. So my question is, if he is setting out the battleground for a general election, how is he going to take the Tory party with him? Obviously, he wants to take the fight to the opposition, but we've seen, as you said, the big beasts lining up to oppose his, new lines on HS2 and net zero. We saw Alok Sharma, Zach Goldsmith on net zero. We saw Boris Johnson and David Cameron opposing what he's going to do on HS2. So, he's going to have an internal war as well as an external war. So good luck to Rishi.
Yanis, welcome to you.
Thank you.
Big week because of the pushback of some of those green commitments. What do you make of that?
Well, it takes a very special combination of incompetence and cynicism to manage to unite the car industry and the Greens against you. And Rishi Sunak has demonstrated that.
Why do you say it's cynical?
Well, because it's very clear that this was the result of the Uxbridge by-election and what's happening in the Netherlands, where there is a backlash from nativist, rightist, anti-climate policy segments of the population. And a desperate prime minister is trying to appeal to that particular clientele, destroying all the credibility that governments, Tory governments, have tried to build up regarding commitments to net zero.
Okay, we're definitely going to get into that this morning with you on the panel and with our guest today. Rishi Sunak spent nearly a year trying to steady the ship after Liz Truss's stormy days in office, but now with an election looming, he's coming up with a bunch of ideas to try to show you what he really stands for. Earlier this week, as we were just discussing, he delayed some green targets set out by his old boss, Boris Johnson, when he was PM, and it looks like the HS2 rail project could be scaled back again. The original plan would have connected London to Birmingham and then Leeds and Manchester. In 2021, the section from Birmingham to Leeds was cancelled. Then we heard the line might end in West London rather than going all the way to Euston. And now the Birmingham to Manchester bit is in doubt as well. So what is Rishi Sunak's plan? Let's ask Grant Shapps. He's just been made Defence Secretary, but in the last few years you've had quite a number of relevant jobs for talking about the green stuff and HS2. When you were Transport Secretary in January 22, you launched the most recent plan for HS2, which would have taken it all the way to Manchester. Is the plan you laid out then going to be delivered in full?
So I think the first thing to say is, I'm reading a lot of this in the newspapers, but there have been no announcements other than the change on net zero, which doesn't change the outcome, which is 2050 still. But on HS2, we do have to respond to the budgets. In particular, we've been hit not just by coronavirus, but also by the war in Ukraine. And I think any responsible government looks at that and says, does this still stack up for what the country requires in terms of where it's spending its resources and at what time? In other words, the sequencing of that expenditure.
Doesn't sound good then.
Well, as I say, I'm not actually privy to any decision on it. It's a while since I was Transport Secretary.
Sure. But you were put up by the government to defend the government today, to talk about the government's plans. So when you asked for a steer, what did they say to you?
Well, I actually came on to talk about defence, but
no, we'll talk about Ukraine. But I
can certainly cover this off. Look. Yes, the country's invested hugely in faster infrastructure for particularly HS2 and travel, and there's a large part of it substantially built. I think the sequencing of what happens next is a perfectly legitimate question when we've been hit by the enormous costs of coronavirus, probably £400 billion, probably another £100 billion from the war in Ukraine. And people rightly will say, well, look, there's a balance of money that needs to be spent on health, education, defence and many other things. At what speed do we want to progress various different projects? So perfectly proper and responsible. And, by the way, I think a serious government looking at the long-term future makes these decisions, even when sometimes they're not popular at that moment, in the interests of the country at large.
OK, as I said, it's not looking good, is it? When the Prime Minister doesn't guarantee it will go to Manchester, the Chancellor said just 3 days ago the costs are totally out of control.
Well, we have seen the costs accelerate a lot, of course.
What are they now, then?
Inflation's been part of that. Well, there are various different estimates, and I think that's one of the things that the government wants to check, particularly on the costs now post the inflationary picture out of the war in Ukraine. But I have to say that it would be irresponsible to simply spend the money, carry on, as if nothing had changed, if there has been a change in that fiscal picture. Having said that, we've spent £33 billion on transport just in the north alone since 2010, and we have plans to, for example, build East-West Rail. That's a line between Leeds and Manchester. So HS2 isn't the be-all and end-all, and there are many other plans as part of that.
I will talk about that line across the Pennines, because there are a number of people who say if you don't carry on with HS2 from Birmingham to Manchester, it makes the improvements across there impossible. But let me come back to that. You talked about, or the Chancellor told us, that the costs are, quote, totally out of control. Does the government accept some of the responsibility for the costs being out of control?
Well, there are a lot of things that will have contributed, inflation being primary amongst them, which is why we've worked so hard to try to ensure we can get inflation down.
Sure.
That means, by the way, one of the big things you do to stop inflation going higher is not continue to borrow money which is unaffordable and therefore pushes up interest rates and therefore adds to your debt costs and interest charges. So that's why it's important to sort of take all of this.
Sure, I understand that, but are you, as the government, accepting some responsibility for the costs going up, or are you claiming it's all external factors?
Well, I just think that, and I was obviously in charge of this project and watching it very, very carefully, what we saw quite a lot of the time was bids that had gone in increasing over a period of time, for example, because environmental considerations were making it more expensive to complete various different parts of the
Sorry,
project.
just so I'm clear, is the government accepting some responsibility for the cost going
Well, look,
up?
I'm not trying to dodge any responsibility. Governments
Are you saying yes then?
Well, let me answer properly.
Please.
Governments take responsibility, and a responsible government does that for everything that it does. But of course, things like an unexpected shock in inflation due to the war and the energy prices and what have you are beyond a government's control.
Absolutely, which is why I mentioned external
forces. Which is what
forces.
we're now responding to quite properly.
John Dickey, Chairman of Business London, you may know him. He says, quote, "The general chopping and changing is a big reason why the costs have risen over the last decade." He gives an example, the pause earlier this year in the work at Euston. Firms working at Euston had to lay off or redeploy hundreds of workers. That costs money.
Yeah.
That's your responsibility.
And you always have. Look, every economist will tell you there's this thing called a sort of sunk cost where all this money's been spent, and so everybody says, well, in which case we just need to carry on spending regardless. That is not a responsible thing for a government to do. I understand it's always easy for those who aren't having to make the payoffs between the balance between health, education, defence, expenditure and everything else to say just carry on spending as if there's no tomorrow. We have to be more responsible.
But it's happening.
And that is what we're doing.
Have you not been responsible up to now then? Because yes, HS2 is the company that runs it, but the Department of Transport oversees it.
Yeah, the Department for Transport does that. But as I mentioned just a moment ago, we've seen very, very high global inflation in a way that no government could have predicted, adding to the costs, and that's primarily
Inflation
what drives this.
Okay. Right. Andy Street, you'll know him well, Conservative Mayor of the West Midlands. He says this would be a disaster for the country if Birmingham to Manchester doesn't go ahead, leaving us with the most expensive white elephant in UK history. And there it is. Is he wrong?
Well, first of all, the bit to Manchester to Birmingham is.
I'm asking about Birmingham to Manchester.
But the first bit is massively constructed, it should be said. If that was left empty, then of course that would be entirely correct. Birmingham to Manchester is on a slower timetable, and I think what we're talking about.
Hang on a minute. You're not answering the point. Andy Street says if you don't go from Birmingham to Manchester, it would be a disaster. Is he right?
I think my point is this would be rather jumping the gun because
in what way?
Because no decision has been made and no announcement has been made. We are, of course, just talking off the back of stories that have been in the papers.
Although, I'm asking about the impact. How about another Conservative? As we bring HS2 to Manchester, our 96 billion investment will bring communities together, create thousands of jobs, generating prosperity and opportunity across the North and Midlands. You know who said that, don't you?
Yes, the 96 billion is not about HS2.
That was you?
Yes, but it's not about HS2. That's about something called the Integrated Rail Plan, which is to do with, for example, East-West Rail and many other developments in the North. As already mentioned, we've already spent record amounts on infrastructure in the North.
It says, as we bring HS2 to Manchester, that's what you said.
Part of that is HS2. A large chunk of it is actually nothing to do with HS2. The £96 billion is an integrated rail plan, which does much more through Birmingham, through the East Midlands, and up to Leeds and across Manchester.
But then, if it doesn't go ahead, isn't it logical then to suggest the opposite of what you promised will happen, that cancelling HS2 to Manchester means people in the north of England don't get the jobs, the prosperity and the investment you personally promised them?
No, I don't agree with that at all, because we've done so much to level up, including, as I've mentioned a couple of times, more expenditure on transport, particularly rail, in the north than I think any government previously. And we are committed still to spending money on our infrastructure, particularly our rail infrastructure, which, by the way, has a massive in-year budget other than just HS2.
So how are you going to do that, the Northern Rail powerhouse across the Pennines without HS2?
Well, the two things are independent. That's effectively HS3 across the Pennines. But the point is this. you have to make decisions about whether you're going to invest in, for example, local transport schemes, which might be very helpful for people who are commuting. Obviously, the large things like HS2, which I think is the biggest construction project in Europe, suck up a lot of that money. Any government has to make those decisions. I was involved previously at looking at that, but
sure.
I just say...
Because this is what your bill said when you laid it down when you were Transport Secretary. Part of the new high-speed line will also be used for Northern Powerhouse Rail services between Leeds, Manchester and Liverpool. So people in the Midlands and the North now say the Transpennine improvements will not be able to happen if HS2 Birmingham to Manchester doesn't go ahead. Are you saying it can?
Well, one, as I say, no decision on HS2 yet. Two, we're not talking about the Northern Powerhouse Rail bit either way here,
no, but the
which
two
is a
are
separate
linked.
thing.
The two are linked.
Well, all railway lines are linked ultimately, but that's not what we're talking about here, and that's conflating two separate issues. But I'd still go back to the main...
But are you saying the improvements can go ahead then on the Northern Powerhouse Rail, even if HS2 from Birmingham to Manchester doesn't?
You'll forgive me, I'm not the Transport Secretary or the Chancellor, and I certainly can't...
It was you who made the links when you were Transport Secretary.
The point I'm trying to make is that every government has to look at the overall budgets and then make serious decisions which go beyond the sort of back and forth in a studio like this.
Okay.
To say, is this affordable under current circumstances? I'm absolutely confident, for example, that when those statements were made, no one knew we'd be in a war in Europe right now. With all of the consequences, all of the costs and all of the inflation.
Of course,
and any government that doesn't go back and then look at it is crazy.
If you do scrap it, of course, it would free up money for tax cuts before the next election. Is that what's going on?
No, again, I'm not, on your programme to announce some budget before the next election.
Yeah, you're in Cabinet, you're part of these discussions.
Here largely to talk about defence, but I'm happy to cover these issues off, and I would say the government will come forward with its plans in due course. But right now, you will have to wait for those plans, I'm afraid.
Let's talk about what Rishi Sunak did announce last week, pushing back some of the government's own deadlines on various green measures. One of them, obviously, the deadline on banning the sale of new petrol and diesel cars. Do you back that?
Entirely.
Do you?
But I want to correct something that has sort of got out there. We have already exceeded all of our carbon budgets. We have the leading position in the G7 in terms of the amount of carbon that we've reduced. And that so-called pushback to 2035 was always the end date for the sale of petrol and diesel cars. What's been missed in this discussion is that what's been moved is the cut-off in 2030, where all cars would have to be hybrid to be sold. But they were always allowed to be sold petrol and diesel if they were hybrid through to 2035.
OK, because that's not what you said earlier this year in March. You said we have set our path, which is by 2030, we'll see the end of the sale of new petrol and diesel. We'll always be more forward-leaning on this stuff from the EU.
Yeah, of pure petrol and diesel by 2030. That was always the policy. 2035 has always been the final phase-out. What we've discovered is that we are running ahead.
I don't think that's right.
It is
2030 was when the ban on new petrol and diesel was coming in.
No, that's incorrect. 2030 was the date at which you would have to sell a hybrid car, but it could still have a petrol and diesel internal combustion engine. 2035 is the date where that would end entirely. 2035 is still the date it will end entirely. So are you saying nothing's changed then? No, what's changed is the sequencing, so that in 2030, you would still be able to sell a non-hybrid car under the current plans, and that's the change. And really, actually, what we've discovered to answer the wider question is we've been moving ahead, way ahead of the rest of Europe. Faster than Greece, faster than France, faster than Germany. You
say that, but in June, the Climate Change Committee, the independent advisors to the government, before Mr Sunak announced the measures this week, was questioning whether 2050, the net zero target, could be met.
Well, that's their job. We set them up to question those things. But let me just look at
Do you not listen to them?
We certainly do, but let's look at the history of it. We have not only met, but exceeded our first carbon budget, our second, our third, on track for the fourth and fifth. We're now working on the sixth carbon budget, which takes us through to 2037. And in that time, we've already identified, even after these changes in pace, to give families some relief, 90% of the things we need to do by 2037. So I'm completely confident we'll get there as well.
OK. We are way behind the rest of Europe when it comes to heat pumps and insulation.
We're way ahead on reducing carbon, and you're right on heat pumps and insulation. We've found it difficult because of our old housing stock to do it. which is why, again, we want to allow more time so we're not penalising households, telling them...
More time? You've been in power for 13 years. If you'd started earlier, people might have lower energy bills by now.
What do you imagine the number of homes which were insulated were back in 2010? I imagine most people won't know. Only 14% of homes. Today, it's approaching 50% of homes which are properly insulated.
And that's because of the government, is it?
Yes, because we've put billions of pounds into doing that. So we've made huge progress. But the thing we're not prepared to do is say to every household, within a couple of years, which is what the policy could have ended up, we'd never confirmed that timetable yet, but it would have ended up saying a ban on gas boilers means that perhaps an average home would spend about £8,000 on having to rip out their gas boiler. Now, if people want to vote for that, the opposition still say that's what they want to do. We think that we can both meet our 2050 commitments and give families a bit of a break and enable them to change their boilers as time comes, rather than force this at a pace which is unrealistic.
OK. 24 days, I make it, you've been Defence Secretary. I wanted to ask you, if a Republican president is elected on a ticket to pull all US support from Ukraine, what would the UK do?
Well, look, I've been, in that short period of time, out to meet my Ukrainian opposite number, the Defence Secretary, actually in Germany, with 50 nations who are backing Ukraine.
So you could do it without the US, are you saying?
Well, look, first of all, that's a while down the line before we see what happens in a
But you must be having those
Republican
conversations
election.
now.
But what I would like to say is that we will carry on standing shoulder to shoulder with our friends in Ukraine. We know the history of Europe. We know what happens when we allow a tyrant to invade a neighbour and then continue westward. And it's absolutely essential that Putin is unable to walk into a democratic neighbour without consequences. And that is why Britain has stood firm, and we will continue to do so.
Can you do it without the US? They are the biggest donor when it comes to humanitarian aid and, of course, lethal aid.
Well, I genuinely believe, as President Zelensky of Ukraine said this week, that actually the Americans see it in their interest and the world's interest to ensure that Ukraine remains a democratic nation. I think that's quite a speculative point you're making. The point I would make is we will stand shoulder to shoulder with our friends in Ukraine. I've just announced tens of thousands of rounds more of ammunition. We've already given them 300,000 rounds and a whole plethora of other pieces of kit and training. By the end of this year, we will have trained 30,000 Ukrainian troops here in the UK as part of an international effort. So our support is watertight. It's very important that Putin doesn't benefit from invading his neighbour.
Thank you very much. Grant Shapps, Defence Secretary, thank you for being with us and talking about all those issues. Tell us what you think of what Mr Shapps has been saying. We'd love to hear your thoughts. You can contact us by emailing kuenssberg@bbc.co.uk or on socials. Use the hashtag #BBCLauraK and we'll try and share some of the conversation a little later in the show. And if you want to read the headlines as the programme unfolds, just go to the live page, the BBC Live page. The address is there for you right now. So what do our panel think? Grant Shapps talking about continuing to be committed to Ukraine and irrespective of what happens in the US presidential election. Yanis, do you think the West has the right policy?
There is a strategic void at the heart of our thinking about the war in Ukraine that really worries me.
Which is what?
Well, what exactly is the strategic end? When I hear President Biden talk about dragging Putin, whom I have characterized the war criminal back in 2001, so let me be clear regarding my position on Putin. But when he says that he's going to drag him to the international court, that means regime change. So is the objective of the West not only the complete defeat of Russia on the ground, but also regime change?
Right. What do you think it should be?
Well, we haven't done very well with regime change in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Libya. We have a chronic bad record, and I very much fear that if there is a regime change in Russia, it's going to be for the worse.
So
somebody who is worse than Putin will take over. As far as I'm concerned, the number one objective should be to return to the status quo before the 22nd of February 2022, to ensure that
So hang on a minute, so reward President Putin with Crimea and the east of the country?
No, we didn't go to war. The West did not go to war, did not support a war against Russia before the 22nd of February of 2022. So for him, it would be a major defeat if he loses Mariupol, Melitopol, and he goes back to where the troops, if the Russian troops go to the barracks where they were in February 2022.
Craig McKinley, what do you think the Ukrainian people would think of that idea?
It's a deal, isn't it? What is going to be the better outcome to stop the war, stop the deprivation, stop the deaths? I mean, these are deaths on a whole scale that we've not seen in Europe since the Second World War. I think Yanis makes some very good points. What is America going to do? It is usually the linchpin. I don't think America will abandon this, actually. I think they will stick with it. And the choice facing the West is, do we do that bit more to actually make sure Ukraine wins? Or do we just sort of allow this war to continue? Now, what worries me more than anything, a bit like the Balkan Wars, first 6 months, front page, then it goes to second page, third page, fourth page. And I feel that we're going up that route now with
Poland
Ukraine.
Has absconded.
And Poland is unhappy because of, the rows about grain. It feels like the coalition is just a little bit fractious now.
Okay.
When you say
what is good? What is good for the West?
Help Ukraine win. Define win?
Well,
what is a victory?
We've given the Storm Shadow missile, which seems to be doing a lot of the heavy lifting in Ukraine.
That's damage, but it's sort of victory.
For many Ukrainians, I've interviewed many of them over the last year, winning is pushing Russia out of Ukraine.
But what does that mean?
And I think it's possible to do.
That means...
Does it mean Crimea?
That means an independent Ukraine from the borders in 1991. That means get them out of the whole of Ukraine.
And what Yanis suggested would mean not just regime change in Russia, it would mean regime change in Ukraine, because now the Ukrainians have fought this bitter war. They're not going to accept any concession on the part of Zelensky when it comes to Crimea.
I'm going to pause
that
there.
That is always a problem. And you see, one of the great concerns I have is what happens to Ukraine after victory. Because let's not forget that war concentrates the mind and creates a huge coalition, patriotic coalition, and then it starts. Think of the Mujahideen. The West helped the Mujahideen defeat the Soviets, and the moment they won, they started fighting one another. But my concern is that we should minimize deaths and have a coherent plan for rebuilding Ukraine. Personally, I would like to see the question of Crimea going to the United Nations.
Okay.
I come from Greece.
Let's pause that there.
The Cypriot question has been discussed for decades, but at least people are not being
Russia is not there.
Rachel, you voted Green, I think, at the last election. Is that right?
I did admit that on my LBC show last week.
So what do you make of the announcement from Rishi Sunak last week? I don't know about you, I felt quite confused by what Grant Shapps was saying about the announcement, because my understanding is...
Which announcement are we talking about?
The petrol and diesel car deadline being pushed back to 2035.
What did I feel about that?
What does it tell you about Rishi Sunak's strategy as we head towards an election?
I think what it tells us that Rishi Sunak is going to make... the lectern that he stood in front of in Downing Street said something like long-term decisions for a brighter future. As I saw it, I thought, no, we're making short-term decisions for a darker future when it comes to transport infrastructure, when it comes to net zero, and all these things. These are populist measures he's going after. These are he's equating green with expensive, which is wrong. Green is going to be very good for the economy if they grip it. So this is what I felt when I heard that.
Does it feel like, we haven't got a decision on HS2, it didn't sound great.
Well, it didn't sound good, as you picked up.
Does it feel like Rishi Sunak is unpicking some of your brother's legacy?
Well, actually, HS2 is not his legacy. It was a Labour. It was a Labour proposal.
Sure, but
initially.
he was the one in 2019 who said we are going to level up.
Well, I do think we need better transport infrastructure in this country, and there's no point kicking the can and making future generations pay for these big decisions. These decisions are hard. They should be taken now, and because if you defer these decisions, it costs more in the long run.
That's true, isn't it, Craig McKinley? It costs more in the long run.
I was always worried about HS2 from day one, way back when. It was too London-centric, and even the dreams, which seemed good.
What do you mean it was too London-centric? It was going from London to Birmingham to Leeds to Manchester.
Now, those bits, fully in favour of. I think this should have been a project that was connecting up the Pennine route. I don't ever think that London needed that extra
Right, well, we are
capacity.
where we are.
Well, we are where we are.
Would you back
but the whole
if the Birmingham to Manchester bit was
the London
scrapped?
bit finishes in Old Oak Common, quite frankly, the whole thing is looking rather shabby now. And some figures that in the Telegraph today, the old spreadsheet was saying that for every pound spent, there'd be £2.40 of increase in economic activity. It's now down to 90 pence. How on earth can a project, first valued at 33 billion, has escalated to 100, and we've now got potential for another 8 billion overlay? Dreams have to hit reality someday, and that's exactly why I think is part of the reason behind the change of the car ban and the oil and gas ban. It's reality, it's pragmatism, and we're going to hear a lot more of that.
If that's true, how do you get growth then, Yanis, if you're cutting back on spending on infrastructure?
Well, you shouldn't cut spending on.
Well
you
said,
just
Yanis.
shouldn't. It's really, and also, but allow me. I'm coming from outside. I don't have skin in the political game here. From the outside, Britain is looking like a country that is becoming very introverted and unable to pursue a large-scale modernization scheme. You had this plan for HS2. The way it looks from the outside,
supported financially by the EU. Don't let's forget. Was it? Yeah, I think it was.
Well,
yeah.
There's no doubt that the British state can support the building of proper railway infrastructure. You can, if you put your mind to it. But it's also a question of credibility. When governments, successive governments, say we're going to build a fast train to Leeds, just get on and build it, because otherwise
even if the costs
you are simply
rise.
revealing. Look, penny pinching has its place. But
we're talking about billions and billions and billions.
You know, all the great modernizing projects of the 19th century, of the Victorian era, they overshot. They cost a lot more money than the railways in the United States bankrupted all the railway companies. But you left behind an infrastructure on which, the modern world has been built.
I would say that money could be better spent on smaller infrastructure projects. Just look at, not too far from here, the Lower Thames Crossing. We've been talking about it for 20 years. We're in about the 4th iteration of a consultation period, and not one bit of turf has been turned.
But as Andy Street says,
those sort of projects are cheaper
colleague,
and I think more economically valuable than some of these
as Andy Street
ones.
says, Mayor of the West Midlands, Conservative Mayor of the West Midlands, if you don't carry this on now, you've actually got a white elephant from Old Oak Common, which is in West London, near Acton, to Birmingham. We don't need that.
I agree with it.
You should.
But we've spent the money.
Well, just build it all the way to Manchester then. Otherwise, don't do it.
Up to central London, I think this is rather a wasteful project now. I really struggle with it.
It has to go to Manchester, otherwise it's a joke. You might as well end it at Watford.
Whose responsibility would it be if this extra bit is scrapped? Not an extra bit, it was integral at the beginning. If this bit is scrapped and we have what is described as a white elephant by some Conservatives?
I
Your
think
Prime
is
Ministers.
well.
Your Prime
We
Minister
cannot
say
just
it,
keep
Craig.
spending.
So what's the answer to the question?
I mean, this will
Sorry,
be a
Craig Kinley,
debt that
what's the answer
my
to-
daughter of 4 will be paying.
Whose responsibility is it if it's a waste of money?
Well, it will be the HS2 Limited, who have not managed this project well, in my view.
Overseen by the government.
I think they have not managed this project well.
You can't
and
share
I'm
the
afraid-
political responsibility. For
Oh, no,
this.
the political vision is there, but it's the responsibility of an agent that's been appointed to do this job. How on earth can you have
goes to the
33
heart of the
billion
issue.
go to 100?
You see,
How can you do that?
With all this subcontracting, you have the deprofessionalization of the civil service. You no longer have in this country, after years of subcontracting, within the civil service, the capacity to design, plan and see through large modernization projects. You end up with contractors working for private companies, talking to contractors working for the government, and no one being in a position to advise the government on what they should be doing.
Well, the Department of Transport oversees HS2 Limited. It doesn't operate in a vacuum. Pause there. Thank you so much for the moment. We will be back with you very, very shortly. Now, in the last general election, the Liberal Democrats won just 11 seats. The leader, Jo Swinson, lost hers. It was a really dismal time for the party. But since then, they have had 4 by-election victories, all of them in what were Conservative seats. Here's a reminder of their leader, Sir Ed Davey's approach to campaigning.
3, 2, 1.
When a really powerful, strong orange force goes against a blue wall, let me show you.
Their party conference started yesterday in Bournemouth. Sir Ed Davey has come to join us and to talk to you today. Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank
Nice
you
to be on
very
your
much
show.
for being here. Can we start with a word cloud, please? Done by the public opinion research group More in Common. They asked this question, and we'll show it to our viewers now. What does Ed Davey stand for? There it is. They've got absolutely no idea. What do you think of that?
Well, I'm glad I'm on your show to be able to explain what I stand for, and in the general election I'm sure people will hear. And it's about, for example, improving our health service and our care system. It's about helping people with the costs of living. They're in real struggling with mortgages and rents. They need political parties to say how they're going to help them. It's on the environment, where we've, for example, led the campaign against the awful sewage dumping. So we're getting over our ideas. Is there work to do? You're absolutely right, Victoria.
But you've been leader for 3 years. They've got no clue about
We've
you.
been winning by-elections, as your clip showed. We've been having success where people have heard our message, particularly in Conservative heartlands. People have been switching to us. I'm really proud of what my colleagues have been doing up and down the country, because it's not just in those by-elections that you showed, where we were persuading lifelong Conservatives to vote for us. It's also been in council elections across the whole United Kingdom, where we've been defying the polls, defying what our opponents and people have said about us, and actually winning, because people have been hearing our message. Won't say don't know, they say yes please, and they've been voting for our parliamentary candidates and our council candidates.
Let's have a look then in a bit more detail at some of your policies. Housing, massive issue
huge.
For renters, for people wanting to buy. In 2021 you said, or your party said, your policy was aiming to build 380,000 new homes a year. This year, you scrapped that target. You said you're going to focus instead on council housing and social housing, and you're committing to 150,000 of those homes a year. Is that enough?
Yeah, well, we're debating this actually on Monday at Bournemouth, exactly this,
what do you think?
This issue. And I think we do need a target for social housing. That's something that...
Why is 150,000 enough?
Well, that's on social housing. We want to build more houses with the private sector. But on the social housing, I'm really glad you picked that up. My wife is a councillor in my constituency, and she's got the lead on housing in the council. And she's now developing the largest council house building project we've had for over 40 years. And it's that sort of investment in local communities to provide the affordable housing that Liberal Democrats stand for.
Right, because the Housing Federation says we need 300,000 homes a year. And government targets are needed to focus people's minds, to focus private developers' minds to make that happen.
Well, we have a target on social housing, which is what's not being built at the moment.
I'm asking about...
Yeah, I'm coming to that. But it's really important to make the point we do have a target on social housing, because that has been the sector that's seen nowhere near enough investment over many, many, many years.
And if you don't qualify for social housing?
Well, first of all, if you do build council houses, and this is often not understood, you free up a lot of houses in the private rented sector.
Just like that?
Well, yes, again, it's really important. It's a problem across the whole country. Councils over recent years have had to, because they've not had enough council houses, put people who needed housing in the private renter sector. And we've now seen the private renter sector, because of Conservative policies, contract. Councils now having to spend huge amounts of money going over budget by putting people in temporary accommodation in hotels. So our policy was actually really good value for money, providing proper council houses, so councils could house people.
You keep focusing on council houses. I absolutely understand the reasons why. Let me ask the question.
Please, can I?
Why have you got rid of the 300,000 target?
Well, we think top-down targets lead to developer-led approaches, as we've seen with Conservatives. And what you see with the developer-led approaches, you see the wrong houses being built in the wrong places. Don't take my word for it. That was what Theresa May said. And our approach, and it's been tried and it's worked, is a community-led approach.
What does that mean?
Well, it means that you have things like local neighbourhood plans. We legislate for those.
So that means the community can object to planning?
Well, actually, the community is involved in the whole stage.
Sure, which means they can object and stop houses being built.
And they can in the developer-led model. But in the community-led model, you take them with you. And let me explain where it's been done, why it's worked so well.
Briefly, please.
It results in houses that people want, in the places they want, with the infrastructure they want. So often you hear that people are objecting not to houses, but they're objecting to the fact there's not enough GPs, there's not enough schools, that the water infrastructure can't take the new homes. So a community-led approach means you're not just thinking about the houses, but you're thinking about the whole community infrastructure. That's what's been missing, and that's what we're keen to deploy.
OK. I mean, is what you're saying really, this policy is about appealing to Conservative voters in Conservative constituencies that you are targeting as we head to the next election? I
actually think our policies on the health service, on the environment...
I'm asking you about housing in Conservative constituencies.
Well, I mean, I think they are popular amongst many people. I think our council house building
You
project.
keep talking about the council house policy. We've talked about that. We know what the target is. I'm asking you, Lib Dems have had success campaigning in Conservative constituencies where you've campaigned against local housing developments. Is that what this is about?
No, it's absolutely not about that. What we said, for example, in the Cheshire-Amersham by-election that we won, and people said we were against houses everywhere, what we were against was developer-led model. And I can't stress this enough. When you take communities with you, you do see more houses being built. Don't take my word for it. There was a report done by the government department responsible that showed that the neighbourhood planning that Liberal Democrats wanted and want now leads to more houses being built.
Okay.
But they have the support that they need from the local people.
Let's talk about relations with the EU. In 2019, you branded yourself, the Lib Dems, as the Stop Brexit Party. Now you're saying people on the doorstep aren't talking about Brexit. Are you going to go quiet on it as well?
Well, I think we're talking a lot about it at our conference, quite rightly. You're right that we did fight against Brexit and we voted against the trade deal that Boris Johnson brought. It was a disastrous deal. We were the only ones to vote against it. Labour didn't, and we voted against it because we knew it would damage our economy and our farmers and so on.
What's the position now?
Well, it's because of that history that I'm very happy to tell you we remain very pro-European. We want Britain to be at the heart of Europe, but we're also deeply realistic about what's going to have to be done to enable us to improve our relations with Europe. Unfortunately, this Conservative government has so soured our relations. European politicians don't trust the UK anymore, and that's a very sad position, and it's against our national interest. So the next parliament, the next government has got to engage with Europe in a way that this government isn't doing.
So the Lib Dems support, unless you've changed this, a longer term objective of UK membership of the EU. Is that still the position?
Well, I've been really clear that Britain must be at the heart of Europe.
Does that mean rejoining?
What it means is we've got to start where we are at the moment and rebuild those relationships. At the moment, European politicians are not listening to the UK, and that's damaging our industry.
And you're deflecting from the question. Is the Lib Dems' position that ultimately you want to rejoin the EU?
Well, that's currently not on the table.
I'm asking you. Well, no, I know it's not on the table. I'm asking you what your policy is.
Well, I'm telling you that in our manifesto, in our pre-manifesto being debated at Bournemouth, we are focusing in on what's got to be done over the next 5 years to strengthen our economy, to strengthen our security, because we're not cooperating with Europe as we should be on tackling crime. That's a disgrace. So I really want, Liberal Democrats really want, is to completely rebuild that trust, rebuild that relationship so we can be at the heart of Europe. That is going to take time. We have to take the British people with us. We have to convince European politicians that we're serious, because they feel very let down, and it's damaged our economy so badly that we're going to have to take time to rebuild that.
And some of your supporters feel let down because they want you to be absolutely clear, yes, we the Lib Dems will rejoin Europe.
Well, I will,
maximise public support for rejoining the EU.
Yeah, well, I think when people hear our policies, they really get that we are the pro-European party. We're the only party. I think this is really fair to
Can you
focus on.
just say out loud, yes, the Lib Dems want to rejoin the EU?
What I want to tell you is our policy. We've passed it at our conference.
Right.
We have a full...
You won't say the words, though. It's so weird.
Well, it's not weird at all, because what I'm focusing in on is how we rebuild that relationship. And it's a four-stage approach.
No, we haven't got time for 4 stages. I think you have made that point.
It's a very good policy.
OK. Coming to the end of our conversation, you were in coalition government with the Conservatives in 2010. You were a minister, cabinet secretary. That was 5 years. It cost you massively in the 2015 election. You've already said you wouldn't do any deal with the Tories ever again, as far as I can see. What about a potential deal with Labour in the scenario of a hung parliament?
Well, you're right to say that there's no way we could deal with the Conservatives.
I'm asking about Labour now.
I'm coming to that. They've ruined our country. I fought them all my life. I fought them actually...
You were in government with them?
Yeah, and I fought them in government every day. For example, we managed to make Britain the world leader in offshore wind.
Let's not go over
and the Tories
13 years ago.
Fought that. Well, I mean, at the moment, I'm just focused on removing lots of Conservative MPs and electing as many Liberal Democrat MPs as we can. That's why we're focusing on the NHS, focusing on the cost of living, focusing on the environment.
Would you go into coalition government with Labour?
One thing I've noticed in politics...
One thing I've noticed is you're not wanting to answer this question.
No, well, I'm going to, if you give me a chance. I've looked at predecessors. I've been in politics a long time. I've worked with a lot of Liberal Democrat leaders. And when they have focused on that question, they've been distracted from the task in hand. And the task I set myself when I became leader of the Liberal Democrats was to be as many Conservative MPs as possible and get the Conservatives out of government. And that is what I'm going to focus on. I'm not going to be distracted. And the more Liberal Democrat MPs we have in the next Parliament, the more influential we can be.
Thank you very much
for
being with us. Thank you. Now, let's hear from the Labour Party. And this week, we're going to talk to Darren Jones. He has just been appointed to the Shadow Cabinet as Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury. He's better known, and he's gone viral on TikTok for his forensic questioning of ministers and business leaders when he was chair of the Commons Business Select Committee. Have a look.
Are you in this mess because you don't know what you're doing, or are you just a shameless criminal? I think, in my view, you're hurting the country, Prime Minister. Do you recognise the system-wide failure that is currently taking place at Royal Mail?
Today, we're going to ask questions of Darren Jones. Thank you very much for talking to us. On the programme last week, Shadow Minister Pat McFadden told Laura this, and hopefully we'll show our viewers this. We want to see the railway being built. This is obviously HS2, but we've got to look at the costs of everything that we do. The next day, your Shadow Minister, Nick Thomas-Symonds, said, we will build HS2 in full, and we will build Northern Powerhouse Rail in full. On Friday, your Shadow Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, said, I would like to see HS2 delivered in full, but we need to see what those costs are. Are you able to clear this up?
Absolutely.
Good.
They're all right. The Labour Party would love to see HS2 built, including the connection to Leeds. We've long said that, which is why colleagues have been saying it on the television. But you'll recognise, Victoria, that the reason we're talking about this is because of leaks from the government. We don't have any decision yet from Tory ministers. We just heard from the former Transport Secretary, Grant Shapps. He has no idea what's going on, and he's a member of the government in Cabinet. And so this is responding to leaks and rumours without any of the information being made available about where the project is at the moment.
So is Nick Thomas-Symonds right then?
Well, he's right that we would like to see...
We will build HS2 in full.
We would like to see HS2 built in full.
No, he didn't say that. He said, we will build HS2 in full. That was last Monday.
What he means is, of course, we would like the government to build HS2 in full.
No,
but
he doesn't.
Yeah.
He means we will build. We, Labour, will build HS2 in full.
I've spoken to Nick, Victoria. And
why didn't he say that?
Well, that's a question for Nick. But he was very clear, as with my colleagues, that we are supportive. We are supportive of HS2 being built. But we're responding to rumour and leak. And look, Victoria, this is a really important infrastructure project. What I say on your show matters because we, the Labour Party, hope to be in government next year. We're not going to make decisions about national infrastructure projects that involve tens of billions of pounds without all of the information being available.
Right.
You and I have the same information that's being leaked from the government. We need to see the costs.
Well, I mean, the information's out there. The books are out there. The OBR
it's not.
It have got the figures of the projections of growth and all the rest of it.
No, the costs are not out there. We don't know what the cost overrun is. We don't know which bits of the projects are costing how much extra money. We don't even know what the Conservatives in government are going to do about connections or endings or extensions. So we can't answer questions until they do so.
So from the Labour Party's point of view, do voters have a right to know what Labour would do about the HS2 bit from Birmingham to Manchester before the election?
Absolutely. And when the government makes a decision and publishes the information, we will consider that properly and announce it in a professional way.
Right. But I mean, you're creating uncertainty there.
No, it's the Conservatives creating uncertainty, and that's why they have to answer the questions. That's why I was pleased you asked Grant Shapps these questions earlier, but it's reflective of the chaos in government that only Rishi Sunak seems to know what's going on through leak, through rumour, through late-night press release. That's not how you run government.
Let's talk about what the impact might be if that leg of HS2 doesn't go ahead, because both Labour and the government have said it will create thousands and thousands of jobs. It will make towns and cities in those key areas more attractive to business. It will boost economic growth. In fact, Andy Street says that's already happening. He's the Conservative mayor for the West Midlands. So if you make a decision that you wouldn't go ahead with it either if you won the election, those jobs won't exist. That economic growth won't happen, correct?
I entirely understand why mayors, Conservative and Labour in the north, are calling for this project to be built. That's why the Labour Party said it would like to see it built. But it's the Conservatives who announced this, 10, 11 years ago, have allowed it to get completely out of hand and not publishing the information. They need to be able to answer these questions.
So what are the costs of not building it?
So we don't know, because the government hasn't published the information. I'm very happy to come back on your show at a later date when we've got that information, when we can give a considered and professional answer. A Labour Party that's serious about government is not going to announce policy on TV shows on the basis of rumour and leaks. We're going to make decisions in a professional way in the interest of the country.
If you decide not to continue the project, then you would be guilty of the great rail betrayal, which is what your Shadow Transport Secretary accused the government of last week, won't you?
Well, we haven't made a decision because it's not for us to make the decision. We are in opposition. I would love for Labour to...
Why do you always wait for what the Conservatives decide, whether it's HS2 or triple lock on pensions, before making your own decisions? Why don't you just step up and make a decision?
Well, because you need the information. There's no point just kind of assuming what the answers to questions will be when we don't have all of the information. That's not the way you should do policy.
Sometimes it's about your principles,
I agree, but this is about money. This is about tens of billions of pounds. It's about the economic impact assessments in different parts of the country. It's about the impact on other rail projects. What I'm not going to do, Victoria, is come on here and answer hypothetical questions that has a consequence, an impact for the workers building this railway, for local communities, for regional mayors. The Labour Party is a serious party preparing for government. We're going to do this in a proper way.
Can I ask about what kind of relationship Labour, if in government, would want with the EU? So Keir Starmer says the Brexit deal that Boris Johnson got was not a good deal. And when it comes up for review in a couple of years' time, he says we will attempt to get a much better deal for the UK. What does a better deal look like to you?
Well, the current trading relationship between the UK and the EU has not yet been fully implemented, and the Conservatives have already had to negotiate add-ons, the Windsor Framework, Horizon and other things.
So what would a better deal look like then?
So there are things that we would want to negotiate with the European Union around security cooperation, about further science and research cooperation, which we think is in the interest of British business, and where at all possible to make it easier for businesses to be able to sell their goods and services into the European Union.
And do you have evidence to suggest the EU would be willing to give us what you call a better deal?
Well, look, the EU is pretty annoyed with the British government, and
but that's not about the trade and cooperation agreement. They actually say that's a very good agreement as it is now.
Well, they would say that because they got a better deal than we did under Boris Johnson's deal of services, for example.
So they're not going to be up really for changing it in a few years, are they?
Well, we've got to reset the relationship with Europe because of the way the Conservatives have handled that relationship. That's why Keir Starmer was with President Macron only last week in Paris, because we have to show that as a country outside of the European Union, and let me be clear, Labour is not rejoining the European Union. Labour is not going to let the country rejoin the European Union, in the next Parliament. We've got to have a better working relationship in the interest of the European economy, where we can add value as the UK, and in the interest of the UK economy.
And what would you be willing to accept in return, then? What for that closer relationship? Because you won't get it for nothing, will you?
Well, there are some things that are in our kind of mutual interest. For example, many European member states are interested in our capacity to produce hydrogen for our electricity interconnectors, for the work we might be able to do on offshore wind turbines in the North Sea. When I go to Brussels, which I have done a lot in my previous roles, there are lots of European countries that want to work with the UK on projects of mutual interest. But because of the relationship and the very thin trading agreement that Boris Johnson signed up to, they're not able to do so.
You could alienate those people who wanted Brexit, who voted for Brexit, who you will need to vote for you at the next election if you want to form the next government.
Well, look, it's the Conservative Party that made promises to people about the benefits of their Brexit negotiations. It's the Conservatives that negotiated a trade agreement that was not good enough.
But it's you who's suggesting a closer relationship with the EU and some kind of quid pro quo, and that could alienate people.
I think most people, whether they voted for Brexit or not, recognise that it's in the interest of British business to be able to sell things that they make to customers in Europe. That is entirely different to us being a part of the European Union. Labour is not saying that we're going to be part of the European Union. We're not. But we do want to make it easier for British business to sell things to European customers.
Do you understand why some voters might not trust what Sir Keir Starmer says about Brexit because he's changed his position so much over the last few years?
Well, Keir Starmer had a personal view, which was the view of the Labour Party in the past. We lost an election in 2019 very significantly. The Labour Party has changed under Keir Starmer. It's listening to the wishes of the British people. So he's changed his principles
as well, has he?
It's not about principles. It's about acting in the best interest of the country. And you've just listened to Ed Davey. No political party is saying for the next election that they would take the UK back into the European Union because practically it's just not a viable option on the table.
But do you want to?
No.
Right. Because you voted, obviously, Remain and all the rest of it.
I did.
Yeah.
But that option is just not on the table, either for the UK or for the European Union.
OK. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Thank you for being with us today. Darren Jones, who is Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury. Thank you. It's nearly 10 o'clock and we've had a very full programme today. Let me take you back to earlier in the programme when we asked Grant Shapps about the future of HS2.
Is this affordable under current circumstances? I'm absolutely confident, for example, that when those statements were made, no one knew we'd be in a war in Europe right now. With all of the consequences, all of the costs and all of the inflation.
Of course,
and any government that doesn't go back and then look at it is crazy.
Thanks very much for getting in touch this morning. Various of you have been emailing in about HS2 wherever you are in the country. Matthew Walker says, when HS1 has been completed in the South East in full, how can elected officials do this to the North and the Midlands? Sam in Greater Manchester says, I don't know anyone in the North who wants HS2. We'd rather the money be spent on connecting northern towns. Colin Ainsley isn't particularly impressed. He says, I'm Scottish. Stop this huge waste of British money. Thanks, everybody, for getting in touch. You can always message us on socials as well. Rachel, the Lib Dems. You once were a member of their party, actually.
I did join the Lib Dems, yes.
Their position on the EU, how do you read it?
Well, Davey made it sound like HS2, he was going to give us a four-stage explanation of what the Lib Dems' new policy was on the EU, you know, like phase 1, phase 2. I just think, having listened to Davey and to the new Shadow Chief Secretary, I just feel there's a really open goal here for going into the next election for any party that's brave enough to do this. Don't say we will not rejoin the EU. The Lib Dems
don't say it.
Yeah, no, you say this.
Right.
We will not join the EU, but we don't want the thin trading relationship. Therefore, we will go back to the argument of 2019. We will rejoin in some way the customs union and the single market. That's why they can say the top line is we are not rejoining, but then beneath the line they can sort out all the friction. Yanis, what do you think?
Well, I campaigned for the Norway Plus solution after the Brexit referendum because I thought that it would respect the verdict of the referendum because it would be out of the EU while creating a small C conservative period of 10, 15 years during which you would be in the single market and the customs union, as you said, Rachel, and give you an opportunity to do that, which the Johnson government and now the Sunak government not done, which is to have a plan for Brexit.
As you know, if
you
you're
don't have a plan for
in the single market and you're in the customs union, you're pretty much in the EU with absolutely no say whatsoever.
You're not.
We've got a
That's the point.
TCA which is deemed to be best in class as an international agreement for free trade, and our trade has increased now than back before COVID times. So it's absolutely
year on year
working.
compared
it's
to
working.
when we were in
We're not
the
in
EU.
recession.
You don't have a
Germany's in recession.
You don't have a single trade agreement that is worth its salt. You do not have a plan for creating. You can't build HS2. You cannot create. You have absolutely no plan. I mean,
isn't it bizarre? We talk about the EU and we're having
If you talk over each other, no one can hear what you say. No. Briefly finish that sentence, then do come back in, Craig McKinley, and then to you, Rachel.
It's very simple. There's still no plan for making Brexit work. And there's no plan by Labour for making the quasi-Brexit that they want. So, you know, a Norway Plus agreement would be a halfway house that would give you time to plan for Brexit, hard Brexit, soft Brexit, whatever kind of Brexit you want.
Is saying,
it's a small C conservative proposal, the Norway agreement.
Theresa May offered us a soft Brexit. Boris Johnson gave us a hard Brexit. Keir Starmer says it's a thin Brexit and he's going to deliver a fat Brexit. My position is there is no such, we want a good Brexit and there is no such thing.
Well, I'd say we've got a pretty good Brexit. The TCA is a good deal. It's not perfect. I'm very annoyed about what's happened in Northern Ireland. That is still unsettled business. The Windsor Framework, in my view, I voted against it, is not satisfactory to leave a bit of the UK in an out hokey-pokey situation.
It's a Good Friday agreement. You want to write that too?
No, I don't.
Whole of the programme could be devoted to that. We are out of time. Thank you so much, Rachel Johnson, Yanis Varoufakis and Craig McKinley. Thank you. That is it. Thanks to the panel and to you for watching wherever you are in the UK. If you want more, I'll be taking Laura's place on the weekend newscast with Paddy O'Connell, which will be available on BBC Sounds from about lunchtime. Part 3 of Laura's documentary, State of Chaos, is on BBC One tomorrow at 9 or on iPlayer from first thing in the morning. as ever. There's loads to chew over on the BBC News website. Have a lovely rest of your Sunday. Thanks for watching. Bye.